Good evening, this is Viewpoint. I'm Zakir Jacob. The clashes between Indian and Chinese troops happened after a stealth-by-night operation by the PLA to capture the icy heights of Yangtze, which is east of Tawang. The Chinese troops were pushed back hard all the way back to their command post. The Raksha Mantri today made a statement in Parliament that this was a unilateral attempt to change the status quo. The opposition is upping the ante by asking for a full-fledged discussion in Parliament. The government says they are ready for it, but at a time and place of their choosing. The moot point is this: did the Chinese deliberately do this as part of a larger strategy, something that we saw in Galwan and other parts of eastern Ladakh in 2020? And if this is indeed part of a larger strategy, then how should India respond?
PLA ट्रुप्स ने तवांग सेक्टर के यांगसे एरिया में लाइन ऑफ एक्चुअल कंट्रोल पर अतिक्रमण कर स्टेटस को एक तरफा बदलने का प्रयास किया। चाइना के इस प्रयास का हमारी सेना ने दृढ़ता के साथ सामना किया है। अध्यक्ष महोदय,
Defence Minister Rajnath Singh informing Parliament that Indian soldiers thwarted attempts by Chinese troops to unilaterally change the status quo in Arunachal Pradesh, Tawang, last week and compelled them to return to their posts. During the confrontation, clashes broke out between the Indian and Chinese side. It happened in a place called Yangtze, about 30 kilometers northwest of Tawang. India has been building border infrastructure here, so have the Chinese. The clash happened on the night between 8th and 9th December. About 300 Chinese troops tried to capture icy heights around Yangtze. If either side manages to capture the heights at 17,000 feet, it would give them visibility up to 25 to 30 kilometers on either side. Hence, there's no need for patrolling in the harsh winter months. More than 2 years after the deadly Galwan clashes, Chinese troops turned to the same playbook. While no lethal weapons were used, PLA troops were armed with clubs, sticks and machetes. Around 6 soldiers were injured on the Indian side. The number of injuries on the Chinese side are believed to be far more.
भारतीय सेना ने बहादुरी से पीएलए को हमारी टेरिटरी में अतिक्रमण करने से रोका और उन्हें उनकी पोस्ट पर वापस जाने के लिए मजबूर कर दिया। अध्यक्ष महोदय, हमारे किसी भी सैनिक की न तो मृत्यु हुई है और न ही कोई गंभीर रूप से घायल हुआ है।
But while India stood firm amid Chinese aggression, the opposition saw opportunity to target the government.
And why I say that is that why are they hiding behind the bravery of our Indian soldiers? Where is their political leadership? Where is their bravery?
But there is a need for a wider and a deeper discussion on why China is doing that.
Home Minister Amit Shah countered Congress with this big attack.
कांग्रेस सरकार ने चीन की धमकी के बाद हमारे रोड और वाइटल बॉर्डर इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर्स का निर्माण डैम चौक में रोक दिया कि राजीव गांधी फाउंडेशन को 2005-6 और 6-7 के वित्तीय वर्षाल में चीनी दूतावास से 1,35,00,000 रुपए का अनुदान प्राप्त हुआ था।
अरे उसका इसका क्या संबंध है? तुम अगर हमारी गलती है तो फांसी पे लगाओ, लेकिन इससे क्यों जोड़ रहे हो? देश की सुरक्षा है।
As the war of words continues, are we headed for a full-blown conflict with China?
All right, on the talking point this evening, Vishnu Prakash is former diplomat, Saket Mishra, China watcher, also joining us, Ashpreet Khadial of the Congress, and Charu Pragya of the BJP will be joining us, and will be joined by Victor Gao, who is a former Chinese diplomat. Vishnu Prakash, let me start with you first. What is your best understanding of what's been going on? Because it's not just what happened in Tawang last week, but we saw what happened in Galwan, we saw the parts of eastern Ladakh which have still not been fully resolved. Is this part of a larger pattern that the Chinese are indulging in, where they are pressing their claims and sometimes even using force, although not lethal weapons, but force to press those claims?
Good evening, Zaka. Absolutely. China harbors no goodwill for India. In fact, they want to undermine India. They want to embarrass India. And they will not miss any opportunity for doing so. In fact, earlier there were some pretensions of cooperation. Those pretensions have been dropped. They are openly opposing all areas, India's core interests in every area. And the build-up along the LAC is such that their infrastructure they are building up at a breakneck speed. And it's a permanent infrastructure. indications are quite clear that they are in no hurry to leave, and they are lying in wait because they will probe us, they will try to provoke us, they will try to see whether they can gain a strategic advantage. That is will be their effort. I would still like to believe that Chinese do not want a full-fledged conflict, but they are not going to leave in a hurry. They are going to keep on trying to gain some advantage, and the best thing is what we are doing is to keep ready and give them rebuff any such attempts. That is the way to handle it.
Saket Mishra, how does India respond to this? Of course, right now what happened in Tawang, there was a fierce pushback. There were about 100 Indian troops who pushed back more than 300 Chinese troops all the way back to their command posts. But besides that, what is the larger strategic manner in which India can take on China? Because let's face it, there is a power differential as things stand right now. Maybe that will correct in 10, 20 years. But right now there is a power differential. The more we seek allies and friends like the United States, the Chinese say you're only going into the US embrace, and that is only further widening the schism between India and China. So how does India strategically address this situation?
The way to do it is...
Saket Mishra, thank you.
Good evening, Zaka. Look, I think, first of all, China has, as our External Affairs Minister said, has no business telling us who we need to work with and who we don't need to work with. But as you very correctly said, I think the challenge with China today is that China fundamentally wants to be the determinant power in Asia, and India clearly offers a very different model, democratic, successful economically, and not really aggressively trying to overpower other countries. So for them, India remains a point of contention, not just because of the border, but because of the larger philosophical issue of, is India a better model for the country, for a country to advance as a global leader or not? Now, within that perspective, clearly what Ambassador Prakash had just said, we need to be very ready on the border. But beyond that, there are, to my mind, a couple of steps that we need to take. First, it's not just the US, but the fact is that China, if you look at, let's say, the Indo-Pacific region and our Indian Ocean region, one of the major issues is China's infiltration into that region, whether it's to Sri Lanka or to the Southeast Asian countries.
Yes.
So in addition to the US, we need to actually expand and use the discomfort that has emerged, whether it's in the Philippines or whether it's increasingly in Indonesia, with the Chinese way of actually expanding, through the islands, through the money. And we need to actually broad base our defense mechanism, and I use the word defense slightly broadly, to cover Southeast Asia as a first step, as a first ring fence around us, in addition to what we do with the US. Plus, I think internally we need to also, again, not immediately, but over a period of time, examine where all we are vulnerable to China, both in terms of imports and in terms of technology that we've taken from them, and prepare to actually substitute that with other sources.
Okay, let me ask Victor Gao before we go to the political spokespersons. Victor Gao, we've seen what happened in Galwan and in eastern Ladakh back in 2020. There were violent clashes leading to the deaths of soldiers on both sides. What happened in Tawang last week was less violent, but nonetheless it was an important marker in how this relationship is not normal, as the Indian Foreign Minister said in Parliament last week. This relationship cannot be normal till the border situation is resolved. Why is China resorting to these unsophisticated but violent means, using clubs and sticks and machetes to press its claims when the border itself is disputed, or large parts of the line of actual control are disputed?
First of all, the overall situation involving China-Indian border has been stable. And the fact that the two armies refuse to use weapons or live bullet to deal with each other whenever problems occur, and rather they are restricted to use fists and arms, for example, is an indication that both China and India want to exercise maximum restraint. And this is not only for the bilateral relations and for the fundamental good of the Chinese people as well as the Indian people, but for the world of peace at large. Now, thirdly, this world is still in the process of witnessing peace as the most important thing anyone talking about war is out of his mind. And for China and India to think about the war between the two largest populations in the world, it is out of mind. So whatever problems there are between China and India, we need to use our maximum courage and wisdom to resort to peace and refuse to be distracted into confrontations, conflicts, or even war. Now, thirdly, the fact that India is bringing the United States to the China-Indian border is a cause of great concern, because if there is some issue that China and India cannot resolve between them, to bring in another country into this conflict or border pursuit will only complicate the situation rather than simplifying the situation. Therefore, thank you for giving me this chance to call for peace again between China and India, the two largest populations in the world.
I'll come back to Mr. Gao on the points that he made, but let me bring in the political spokespersons, Charu Pragya and Ashpreet Kadyal. Charu Pragya, the opposition is saying this is a grave security breach. Let's have a full-fledged discussion in Parliament. Parliament is in session. Please explain how this incident happened on the 9th of December until the 12th. Parliament was in the dark. And even today, the Raksha Mantri made a very brief statement. The government has not given any indication of when this discussion will take place, if at all it will.
Dhaka, this is an issue which should not be politicized, and unfortunately, Congress and some opposition parties choose to do just that. There are very few leaders in the opposition. There are definitely some who are still sticking to pro-India statements, and I will request to those who are trying to rake this up and create a political storm out of this should refrain from doing so. The Prime Minister of this country and the government of this country only have India's best interests at heart, and we have proved that time and time again when never tested. The same cannot be said for the Congress party. I can get into a list of things that Congress leaders have resorted to over the last very many decades, which have been more pro-China than pro-nation. And the latest of that has been the funding which Congress party has been receiving from China. Secret MOUs signed, God knows what all. That being said, coming to the topic at hand, the Indian Army, if I can use the Hindi word saksham, they are more than capable of dealing with the skirmishes that happened. They're unfortunate, definitely. Okay. But if you listen to the statements made by the Indian Army and our Raksha Mantri, they point in one direction. India is secure, India is safe, and it will continue to be so.
All right, Ashpreet Kadyal, fact of the matter is that these skirmishes have happened even when the UPA was in power, and it is continuing to happen because the boundary has not been demarcated. By making an issue out of it, saying that the PM has to come to Parliament, HM has to come to Parliament, have a short duration discussion on this, aren't you undermining what should have been a united national response to such a security breach?
Hasn't the Bharatiya Janata Party done exactly that when they failed to tell it to India, to the country, to 130 crore people who voted them to power, that somebody has intruded into our home? They did that before. They're doing the same thing again. First of all, we salute the Indian soldiers that fought bravely and gave a befitting reply to the PLA. However, for the Bharatiya Janata Party's government, they have been keeping India in dark. I mean, how can the Bharatiya Janata Party not tell the people of India that something of this sort has happened? And the defense minister only spoke about it after the media report came to forth. And I want to know it from the Bharatiya Janata Party as to why do they hide such things? Are they trying to protect Mr. Modi's image at the cost of India's national interest and integrity? And number two, isn't China being emboldened because of this? When China sees that, the government is not even conveying it to their people, their interests, their vision, their attacks, they get emboldened because the government has failed to do that. And number four, China is openly intruding. And what does Mr. Modi do? He goes to Bali, greets Xi Jinping with a red shirt instead of a lal aankh. I mean, the Bharatiya Janata Party's inaction, incompetence and inexperience has led to this. First Galwan, then Depsang, now this.
Okay, Charu, respond. What sense does it make for PM to have that brief interaction with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of Bali G20 when even in the eastern Ladakh sector, where even today Depsang and Demchok, those issues have not been, those friction points have not been resolved. Now you have a fresh one in Tawang. Shouldn't India take a serious, hard re-look at the bilateral relationship itself?
Dhaka, and how does the Congress party advice to resolve any issue that India has with China by getting into a full-fledged war? Is that what they are asking for? These are the very same people who cry out against a war when it suits them. And for China, I don't understand what are they looking to do at all. I really don't. So if there is no discussions, if there is no communication, how are you going to resolve an issue? We know very well that the Indian and the Chinese army's highest officials have been in conversation, in discussions and conferences for the last more than a year to redefine the border and make sure it is kept defined for the months and years to come.
Okay.
That is happening by discussions. They need to remember that. Are you crying out for war at a time like this? I think Prime Minister's foreign policy has proved itself to be for the best of this country. We have seen more and more positive developments happen for this country with the Prime Minister's Modinomics, with the Prime Minister's
Let me ask Vishnu Prakash, we've had 20 rounds of talks on this disputed border. It started at the time when Mr. Vajpayee was Prime Minister and I think Hu Jintao was the Chinese President. It's been going on and on. There is a feeling in the Indian security establishment, the reason why we are not seeing any kind of resolution in those talks is because it is in China's interest to keep this power differential going, to keep this issue on the front burner. From time to time, they can turn on the heat on this issue because it suits them strategically and tactically. If that is the case, A, do you agree with that assessment? And B, if that is the case, then how does India deal with this hot border, as it were?
What is the choice? If we don't talk, do we fight? To say that Prime Minister had shaken hands with Xi Jinping at Bali, so should he have gone and stared at Xi Jinping? Would that have served a better purpose? We have a situation where we have a powerful adversary and they are doing what they are doing. So we have to make sure that we secure ourselves, we engage in a meaningful dialogue. Yes, it has taken a long time. Maybe it will take another 50 years. But talking is much better than fighting. And that is what India is trying to do. In the meantime, the reason China is behaving the way it is behaving is that the comprehensive national power balance is shifting. But we are now catching up.
Okay.
We are building infrastructure. We are extending our linkages with other countries. We are strengthening our relations with countries around China. That's the way to do that. So, it's very easy to say that let us shut shop, let us stare at each other, let's start fighting. I mean, that is not the solution. This is not the time of war. You have to give peace a chance. You have to be patient, but the patience has to be backed up with a power to defend yourself and respond befittingly if required.
Mr. Gao, the problem that happened in 2020 in the western sector, which is in Ladakh, and what has happened today, last week in Tawang, is that the Chinese are the ones who are trying to unilaterally change the status quo. No one is disagreeing that these are disputed structures, these are disputed points, friction points along the line of actual control. But the difference in the Chinese PLA's behavior over the last couple of years has been they are pressing these claims in a more violent fashion. They are pressing these claims in a way that, as the Defence Minister of India today told Parliament, it's one side that's trying to unilaterally change the status quo, and that to India is unacceptable.
With due respect, allow me to disagree completely with what you just now said. There are indeed territorial disputes between China and India. But allow me to emphasize, China is not to be blamed. Neither is India. Who should be blamed? It is the British Indian Empire that should bear the responsibility. Because for thousands of years, between China and India, there have never been territorial disputes. The people on both sides of the border lived in peace with each other for thousands of years. It was the British Indian Empire which wanted to expand into China's Tibet region, and thus they caused a lot of territorial disputes, and therefore we really need to look at history, and we really need to know that peace will always be more desirable than war. And it is absolutely the wrong time for either China or India to think about war against each other. Why? Because both of us need to have development. Both people need to cherish peace. And we need to use wisdom to negotiate and do all kinds of peaceful talk to calm down the border disputes on the one hand, and then try our best to figure out what should be the best solution.
Okay.
We should not become victims of the British Indian Empire.
But you know, you can't go back to the 18th century and redraw the McMahon line.
Get along with each other in peace.
Let me ask Saket Mishra that, because I don't think this can be seen in isolation. It's not like China, India are the only border disputes that are flaring up from time to time. You look at all the maritime disputes that China has, whether it's with Japan, with South Korea, with Indonesia. These also flare with Vietnam. It keeps flaring up from time to time. And all of those countries also say the same thing, that it is because China wants to be the preeminent power here in the Indo-Pacific, and that's why they are claiming these islands, and that's why they're going there and building these airstrips and other military infrastructure. They want to do something similar along the LAC. It's time that India realizes this larger design, this larger pattern.
Zaka, absolutely correct. And respectfully, I would like to also disagree fairly strongly with Professor Gao. See, China, if you start looking at re-engagement of China with the Western world from the 70s onwards, had a free ride for about 20, 25 years when they kept promising X, Y, Z, liberalization of trade regimes, no manipulation of currency. And in effect, they built up an economy based on these premises. It seems that the world has caught on to that, and the world is therefore stopping that. Similarly, some of the initiatives that they took in terms of helping and, well, I would say trying to buy other countries through debt, that has also come a cropper. Therefore, China now is almost being forced, along with the fact that President Xi Jinping is facing internal dissent that perhaps he did not foresee earlier. Therefore, the only path that they're taking is through violent actions, whether it's here or it's going after an Australian Coast Guard ship or an Australian plane or a US plane, because guess what? These are international waters. And the term status quo is highly misleading because that has been the consistent strategy. It's like a strategy where they would come, whether it's with us, whether it's with the Philippines, whether it's with Japan, whether it's with other countries. You grab a little piece of land, and then you talk about status quo, and that becomes a status quo because the other person does not respond or has not defended.
It's as saying this is the new normal in the Chinese parlance. But I'll give the final words to the political spokespersons, Charu Pragya and then Ashpreet Karyal. Charu, when can we expect a debate and a slightly more broader statement, not just on what happened in Tawang? Of course, the details have been shared by the Raksha Mantri, but what is India's larger plan to deal with this menace? You have Quad on the one side, you have partner countries and friendly countries like the US, Australia, Japan, etc. But ultimately, none of these countries are going to fight your fight. It is up to India to fight this fight.
And the Indian Army and the Indian government are geared up very strongly to take this fight forward. Not 1 inch of Indian land is going to any other country. And that is a statement I make with a lot of confidence. In the times to come, when the time is right, our defense minister, our army senior officers will be making statements. I only appeal to the opposition right now to keep India first and not their own political selfish motives.
Okay, Ashpreet, I'll give you the final word. You may dismiss this as, diversionary tactic. What's the point of we're talking about what happened in 62 today? But fact is that 62 war is fundamentally and primarily responsible for this baggage from history that we're dealing with even today.
What's responsible for what China is doing to India today is the policy of Mr. Modi, the Bharatiya Janata Party's government, which is DDLJ, deny, distract, lie and justify. That is what they have been doing ever since they came into power, and that's why India is having to pay a cost for that. Our army is having to pay a cost for that. I haven't been able to understand as to why the Bharatiya Janata Party has not been proactive. They have, due to their lies, their mismanagement, their timidity. Today, China is, trying to overpower India. We have been nice to them. We have been trying to appease them. We don't understand why is Mr. Modi quiet all the time over these issues. And when we say you should debate upon this, the Bharatiya Janata Party would not give a proper reply, as if, they can
we'll have to leave it at that. We'll have to leave it at that. All I'll say is two things. I've got to wrap up. All I'll say is two things. Yes, Do we need to see a discussion on this on Parliament? Of course, we absolutely do. Yet at the same time, there needs to be a unified response. We see this in America when it comes to national security. The Democrats and the Republicans, they may have 100 things that divide them, but when it comes to national security, they have a unified response. And I think it's high time that we see that here in India as well. As we close, I'm going to toss to an explainer that I did a short while ago, explaining the terrain, the lay of the land, why this particular area of Yangtze was chosen by the Chinese, by 300 PLA troops to try and get those icy heights, capture those heights, get area domination even as the winter sets in just before the snow. Why were they trying to do that? What is it that the Indian troops did to push back and push them all the way back to their command posts? And why this may be the new normal in these disputed areas. So this latest clash that happened between Indian and Chinese troops comes 2 years after what we saw in Galwan. It's important to understand where this happened. It's happened in a place called Yangtze, and let's try and sort of locate Yangtze on a map in the eastern sector for you. It's very close to Tawang. It's about 25-30 kilometers northeast of Tawang. Remember, Tawang is the last big command headquarters that we have as far as the eastern side is concerned, the eastern sector is concerned. Remember, both India and China have been building infrastructure, particularly the Chinese side, heavy-duty infrastructure leading all the way up to some villages on the other side of Yangtze. India, too, has been building a new road in a place called Bamla, east of Bamla, and before this clash point that happened in Yangtze. So there has been massive infrastructure build-up by both sides on either side of this clash site called Yangtze. Now, the important thing to understand is that this clash, this happened on the intervening night between 8th and 9th of December. This was last week. It happened at 3 a.m. And we're given to understand that about 300 Chinese PLA soldiers, that's not a small number, 300 Chinese PLA soldiers in the dead of the night at 3 in the morning tried to capture the icy heights. Remember, these heights are 15,000 feet, 17,000 feet. The attempt was to try and capture the heights and get area domination around the Yangtze. Now, why this is important is if either side manages to capture these heights, like I said, the plateaus here are 10,000, 12,000 feet, and the peaks, the heights, are at anywhere between 15 to 17,000 feet. If either side manages to capture this, and remember this is disputed site, all along the 3,500 kilometer line of actual control that runs all the way from Ladakh in the western sector all the way up to Tawang in the eastern sector, there are about 20 to 25 recognized disputed spots. Yangtze happens to be one of them. If either side captures Yangtze, then what it means is it gives you visibility, the area domination, the height advantage. It gives you visibility for about 25 to 30 kilometers on either side, on the Indian side as well as on the Chinese side. Now, this is not the first time that this place, Yangtze, has been a site of dispute between Indian and Chinese troops. This same place, the Chinese troops had tried something similar at a much smaller scale, though, in October of 2021, that was last year. Similarly, they had done so in 2016 as well. Now, that time too was around that October-November period. Why they're doing this now at this point of time is once the snow sets in, the terrain is very difficult, the weather is inclement, you cannot move around these areas very easily. It's very difficult to move large number of troops. Therefore, they were looking for that height advantage. And like I said, Yangtze is already one of the recognized disputed sites along the 3,500 kilometer line of actual control. What is important to understand is China has been building on its side of the Yangtze, it has been building what are called these settler villages. What it essentially does is it takes a large number of these veterans or people who have served in the paramilitary forces in China and settles them in these so-called settler villages. On the other side of Yangtze is a village called Xiaokang, which is being used as a launch pad. That's the fear. There are about 600 such settler villages all the way from eastern Ladakh in the western sector, in the middle sector, in Himachal and in Uttarakhand, and of course eventually in Tawang in the eastern sector. These 600 villages, and this is what Indian Army veterans and people in the forces also believe, that these villages, these settler villages like Xiaokang on the opposite side of Yangtze are being used in a way by the Chinese PLA troops to try and use them as launch pads for these kind of stealth operations.